We continue looking on and seeing what God says to us about authorities that we have over us in our lives. We have lots of authorities over us in various contexts, and God gives us instruction on this and enables us to see how Jesus is and how we can be like Jesus in this matter as well. I read to you God's word, eternally true. 1 Peter 2, beginning in verse 11. Dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. Live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the brotherhood of believers. Fear God. Honor the king. Here ends our reading. We have a response of thankfulness. It's printed for us on our bulletins there on the lower left. The word of the Lord. Thanks indeed. Let's pray. We began last week looking at this passage and addressing the topic that Peter addresses here, that the Lord inspires through Peter in the 60s to various people in the churches around Turkey and the various regions around Turkey at that time. And he addresses these folks on the topic of authorities and how do we respond to authorities. Authorities at that time were not Christian. They were not promoting the worship of Jesus. Rather, they were Roman authorities, and they believed that Caesar was God, that he was divine, that he had been dropped down from heaven to bless the people of his kingdom. That was the Roman understanding of who their emperor was. The problem was that this was not true, and often the emperor was very immoral. And at the time Peter is writing this, he is in prison in Rome, and he is writing as an emperor, one of the most notoriously bad emperors reigned over the Roman Empire, Nero. Nero was known in history for setting Rome on fire and blaming the Christians so that he could at the same time persecute Christians who had resistance to this idea and would not bow the knee to him as divine. But also he could rebuild Rome and put his name on all the buildings. And so this is not a Christian conspiracy theory. If you read any book of history from any source, they will tell you this is most likely the case that Nero set the fire, or had the fire set of Rome so he could rebuild it. Nero also was famous for impaling Christians. That means taking poles and shish kebabbing them from bottom through head and dousing them with fuel and lighting them on fire to light his garden for his garden party at night. Nero was also known for being, as you might guess, insane. Again, this is not Christian conspiracy theory. This is if you read any history book and read about Nero, it was strongly believed to be that he was insane. And so Peter writes these words not under the auspices of a kind and gentle ruler, not in a nation that said Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Okay, that's us. We've got benevolent rulers 5 times over compared to Nero. But Peter writes this at a time where he's in prison because he believes in Jesus in Rome, in the city where the Emperor Nero is reigning. And he's in this place where his brothers in the faith are being persecuted in various places in the kingdom, especially there in Rome. He's under this emperor who is lighting Christians on fire for his entertainment. And so we keep that in mind. And as I said to you last week, as we look at this passage about submission to our authorities as believers in Jesus, we will get to exceptions and cases where we must disobey, and that will cover 0.7% of the situations you have in your life. So again, this week, I beg your pardon and ask for you to put your objections and yeah buts in your pocket right now, because I have those and you have those. And as Stuart Mazzell said to me this week, or was it Tim Inman said to me this week, that's just hilarious how quickly people, none of you did it, and you were wonderful last week and through the week, but how quickly people are like, but, and wanting to gut God's commands of all their substance by exceptions. Because we in our hearts, all, me included, want to rule. We want to decide what we can do and can't do. And what we want to do and what we should do, we think are the same thing. But we read God's word and we read of it that it teaches us and it rebukes us and it corrects us and it trains us in how to live. And so God does that for us so we live in his way instead of in our way. So we will get to any kind of exceptions, that kind of thing, next week or the week after that. Okay? And so right now, just hear the command. Hear the reasoning for the command. And let that fully sink in. Don't be like, oh yeah, this is what I'll do if the stars line up and if I happen to be awake at that time. Okay? Let this be the thoroughgoing thing that you always do, so that it is odd that you ever have question in your mind or that you see a situation that might be an exception to this. And here certainly Peter's circumstances that I've reviewed for you in the last few minutes, which were circumstances nearly the same that Paul was in when he wrote Romans 13 and said just about the same thing in that passage that Nate read for us. So this morning, last week, we talked about the command Christians and authorities, and it was this, and it's your point 1 there, and I just put it there for review. Submit to your authorities. That's verse 13 here. Peter says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to this kind or that kind or the other kind. Submit yourselves to every authority instituted among men. So whether it's a president or a prime minister or a governor or a teacher or a coach or your mom or your dad or the customer service person at Walmart, or, as I said to you last week, the traffic control person at your kid's elementary school. Okay? She or he is in charge. Or the principal at your kid's school. Or the coach that you have. He's the authority. And God says we as Christians live our lives distinct from the world. We live, look at verse 11, as aliens and strangers in the world. And part of being a stranger in the world or alien to the world is we obey our authorities. We submit to our authorities. We, look at the very end of the passage, verse 17. We honor the king. Are you odd in this country if you honor your president? Yes, you are. But we're aliens and strangers. We're different, just like Jesus was different. And so we look at this morning and say, how is it that we're to be, as Paul refers to in Ephesians 4, like stars shining in the night in an evil and perverse generation? How are we to be very, very different than the world that's full of slander and downgrading and lack of submission and rebellion against all authorities? Now, this is not that the world is bad and that we're good. Our hearts are just as bad in terms of what we naturally want to do. We want to do what we want to do. And God always in his word says, no, you don't. Stop right there. You want to do, and part of the Spirit of God working in you is you increasingly want to do what God wants you to do, and often that's different than what you want to do. And by the way, it'll be to your blessing. That's the Christian life. Okay, so submit to your authorities, regardless of who they are, and submit to their laws. Submit to their laws. If you disobey the laws, if you disobey the rules of your authority, you're disobeying your authority. Okay, so we don't cut corners. We don't say, well, I'll obey an authority if he directly tells me to do something. No, my authority puts laws in place. If he puts a policy in place, we follow that. Okay. Paul says the same thing in Romans 13:1, of course, too. All right, now the substance of what we're talking about this morning. Why obeying authorities, as Jesus did, makes sense. Why does this make sense? God doesn't give us random commands that will make our lives be terrible. He doesn't give us random commands that will make our lives terrible. He gives us meaningful commands that will make our lives better. And these commands make sense. They're logical. The thing that gets us to be illogical is not our faith. The thing that gets us to be illogical is our evil hearts. Okay? When I'm illogical, it's because I want something and I stomp on logic to do what I want to do. But God gives us this logical command. He tells us why obeying our authorities makes sense. Why submitting to our authorities, whether they're kings or governors or teachers or coaches. Why this makes sense. A in your outline there. So 2A, why obeying authorities as Jesus did makes sense. A, because God is sovereign and he has put them there. Now we just touched on this last week. God is sovereign and he has put them there. Romans 13:1 says this specifically. We see it said in kind of a passive way in verse 13 in our passage. Submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men. But Romans 13:1 gets at the fact that God has placed every authority there. God has done this. So we obey these authorities because God has put them there. God is sovereign. He's put them there. Jesus said in John 19:11 to Pilate that Pilate was there before him, ruling over him, and Jesus was being submissive to his rulership. You realize Jesus had the power to pulverize Pilate into a pile of ashes right there if he wanted to. Right? He could have done that. Jesus could have argued his way out of it. He could have shown the Pharisees to be lying. Could have done all these kind of things, but he submits to Pilate's authority. And he says to Pilate, you would have no authority over me had that authority not been given to you from above. Jesus recognizes this, that God, the Father, puts authorities in their places. Your coach, your teacher, your boss, your supervisor's supervisor, God has put them there. God is that sovereign. You think your boss is bad, that if you have a bad authority, well, give Pilate a good look. He puts the only sinless person in his entire realm on a cross. He puts the person who backs up paying taxes to the Roman government among the Jewish people. He puts him on a cross. And he leaves unpunished those who are arguing that Jews, if they are faithful, should not pay taxes to Rome. Okay. So because God is sovereign and God has put them there, obey your authorities. Submit to your authorities. We see this in Daniel as well. We see it in Joseph too. Now, number 1 there, 2a1. God is sovereign. He's put them there. And that God puts authorities in their places, a little qualifier, does not mean he approves of everything they do. Okay? You know, if you've put someone in authority, that it doesn't mean you approve of everything they do. Sometimes they do things that are egregious to you, that bother you, or that you have to correct. Sometimes they do things where you have to fire them. Okay? Same thing with God. God puts authorities in place, and guess what? No authority that he has put in place, except for Jesus, has gotten it right all the time. They've all made mistakes. And he knows that. And he says, submit yourself for my sake to every authority that I've instituted among men. Okay? So God puts authorities in their places. That he does that does not mean that God approves of everything or even most of what they do. Daniel faced a king who had demolished the temple in Jerusalem. And Daniel gives that king his best service. And he submits to that king. And he interprets that king's dream to that king's benefit. Pharaoh was worshiping all kinds of foreign gods and was the one of the nation in which Joseph had been greatly mistreated and was living as a slave. Yet Joseph comes to this pagan king and serves him. He's submissive to him. He interprets the dream and enables all of Egypt to prosper when great calamity could have been theirs. Moses comes before Pharaoh, and even as he comes before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh in Exodus 1 has been killing Jewish babies, Hebrew babies, from the moment of their birth. Pharaoh's order, Exodus 1, was to send his soldiers out, and he told the midwives, as soon as you give birth to or deliver one of these Hebrew babies, if it's a son, kill it. Okay, this was the Pharaoh that Moses dealt with, yet Moses submits to Pharaoh. He goes, he makes a request, Pharaoh says no, and Moses says, okay. And he goes back and says, God, what's next? God says, okay, go to him again. I'm going to send this plague. So Moses goes again. He says, Moses, God says, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, no. And Moses submits. And this keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. And the reason when God's people finally get out of Egypt, it's because Pharaoh has given permission. Even Moses, in this cataclysmic event that happens on Egypt, in which God is judging Egypt and the Egyptians and Pharaoh's gods, which is what the Exodus says, even then, the leader of God's people is obeying the authorities that God himself has put in place. And God indicates that to Moses, that he's put Pharaoh in place and that he'll harden his heart that God might show his glory among the nations. So you've got one that's doing infanticide in Egypt there. You've got Nebuchadnezzar who's flattening the temple. And yet we have these judges or these kings who are doing evil things. And God is not saying he approves of the evil things, but he has his people submit. Okay? So that an authority does an evil thing is not a ticket to lack submission to your authority. Okay? Peter's in jail. Paul ends up in jail. And they submit to their authorities, even though these authorities are wicked. Number 2, Because God is sovereign and he's put authorities in their place, it does not mean that it is his will that they, or it does mean, sorry, that it is his will that they in particular are over you. That wicked Pharaoh was in place over Moses was God's will. That Nebuchadnezzar was over Daniel was God's will. That Pilate and Herod were over Jesus was God's will. And for you, that's what you need to have sink in. And for me, the same thing. The authorities we have over us, God could have put someone else there, and he didn't. He put that particular person there at this particular time for you. We don't want to say that. Because when someone does something who's an authority and we don't like what they say, we want to say it's a mistake. And God says, excuse me, I'm sovereign. Excuse me, I care for you. Are you calling my care for you less than adequate? Do you see what an insult it is? This is fifth commandment stuff. Honor your father and mother. And as the church and theologians have talked about this command over the year, they see this principle in it. This is not just honor your father and mother in the home. This is honor your authorities. God has sovereignly given you your mom and dad. He's sovereignly given you your president, your governor, your boss, your coach, your teacher, your principal, your representative at the store that you're at. Okay? He's done that. And he's done that for his glory and because he cares for you. Now, we don't want to say that when they do something that's hard for us. And we're not saying that means it's going to be easy for us. It wasn't easy for Peter as he sat in a jail. It wasn't easy for Jesus as he hung on a cross. Okay, but it does mean God's sovereignty that the person who's over you in authority is there because God has put them there. Romans 3, verse 1. Okay, number 3. Thus to rebel, and this is what Paul gets at, but Peter too. Thus to rebel against these authorities is to rebel against God. Do you get that? Okay. If you're a head football coach and you make the hire for your offensive coordinator, and that offensive coordinator calls the plays, and your quarterback runs a different play, guess who's in trouble? The quarterback. And the quarterback says to you as the head coach, he says, yeah, but it wasn't the right play. You say, hey, he's the authority. I put him there. You listen to him. There's this command that comes down, or this chain of command. And Romans 13. For there is no authority except God which is established. Verse 2, consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. So the question is not whether you like what's being commanded. The question is God sovereign or not? And do I want to obey him? Again, Paul loses his life to Rome. Peter loses his life to Rome. They both write from prisons. And this is what they say. B. Here, B. So why obeying your authorities makes sense? Because God has put your authorities in place. And so to obey those authorities is to obey the Lord. Romans 12:2. Okay? So that makes sense. If God wanted something else there, he would have put something else there. Okay? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel, Joseph, Moses. They all have authority. Jesus. They all have authorities. Paul, Peter. They all have authorities that are declaring things that they don't want to be declared. But they submit. They submit. Second reason why it makes sense. Not only has God placed your authorities there, not only has he given you your particular dad or your particular mom or your particular boss, but also because submitting to your authorities is being like Jesus. Submitting to your authorities is being like Jesus. Jesus doesn't say, hey, I'm God, I can do what I want. Isaiah 53:7, we read it. You can look at it in your declaration of the gospel, right in the middle there. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. This describes Jesus. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Jesus submitted to all his authorities, and he is our example in this. He's not an exception. He doesn't say, well, I don't have to obey my authorities, but you guys do. Ha, ha, ha. He shows us how to obey our authorities. He shows us how to submit to our authorities and how that's the right thing to do, even if it costs you your life. Right? Jesus submits to his authorities, and it costs him his life. He didn't have to go to Jerusalem. All his disciples said, Jesus, don't go to Jerusalem. They're seeking your life. And Jesus goes to Jerusalem. And Jesus submits, he tells Judas, okay, go do it. Go tell him where I am. Your time has come, Judas. Go do it now. Jesus submits. He doesn't run from his authorities. He faces them and he submits to their unjust judgments all along the way. False accusations, bad thinking, political, people-pleasing decisions. Pilate knows Jesus is innocent, and he crucifies him anyway because he's afraid of the crowd. How good is that for a governor? Okay? But Jesus submits. It's some of you know, one of my stinging questions that brought me to faith was as a 5-year-old seen in the movie King of Kings as Jesus was portrayed there up on a cross. I said, Mom, she was ironing at 203 Copsville Drive in Rochester, New York. And she was ironing and the TV was on. It was showing King of Kings. And I said, Mom, why doesn't he just zap all those people and get off the cross? He'd done all these miracles. I believed he could do that, and he could have. But instead, he submits to his authorities. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Here are some ways Jesus submitted and people or that Jesus submitted to. Number one, Jesus submitted to his Father. Remember Gethsemane? He says, Father, if it be your will, take this cup from me, this cup of death. But not my will, but your will be done. This is Jesus showing us how to respond to an authority who's asked us to do something we don't want to do. To die. And Jesus says, but I'll do it. Father, you're the one that calls the shots. You sent me here, and you're sending me to the cross. Not my will, but your will be done. That's our basic response to authorities. Someone's our authority. When they say, well, no, this is what we're doing, that's what we do. Okay? So he submits to his Father and he goes to the cross. It's Jesus with Pilate as well. Jesus submits to Pilate's authority. He could have escaped. He didn't. He submits to the authority of the Pharisees. Goes through their mock trial or their farce of a trial where witnesses can't agree one to another. And they're handing one of their own over to the Roman government. He submits to Herod as well. So you've got Jesus submitting to the Father, to the Pilate, to the Pharisees, and to Herod, even though it meant his ruin. Okay, so it's not submit to your authorities when it looks like it's going to work out for you. Jesus' example for us is submit to your authorities, even to your ruin. You know, the uncomfortability in here is thick, and that's good, because that's where we are. There's no greater injustice ever on the face of the earth than when the authorities told Jesus, you're going to the cross. If there's ever a reason, right, to say, well, that's an illegitimate authority, that's it. Yet Jesus submits. It's like last week when we were looking at Esther chapter 7. And all the Jews are going to be extinguished, and not distinguished, extinguished. And Esther goes to the king, and she's made him 2 banquets, and she very submissively and with great honor goes to the king, and he says, now, Esther, what's your request? Up to half of my kingdom, I'll give it to you. And she says, well, O king, save my life and the life of my people. Now, if we had just been sold as male and female slaves in your kingdom, I wouldn't have even bothered you. But this man, Haman, has sought our lives. So save our lives. Do you see the extent, the understanding of submitting to your authorities? And so that's what's presented for us. And with Jesus, we have no escape from this. So number 2 there, when you submit to your authorities, therefore, that should be you are giving them a glimpse of what Jesus is like. You're giving them a glimpse of what Jesus is like. You know who was the greatest citizen in the Roman kingdom during Jesus' day? Jesus. You know who were the greatest citizens in the Roman kingdom after Jesus died? Believers. Because they were submitting to their authorities, even unto death. So when we submit to our authorities, we give people a glimpse of what Jesus is like. Jesus submitted to authorities. Jesus didn't say, I don't have to listen to you, I'm God. Okay? Think of all and yourself and your background and all the Christians you've heard. He said, I don't need to do this. So when you submit to your authorities, you're giving them a glimpse of what Jesus is like. And this is odd, and this is strange, and Peter calls us aliens and strangers in the world. Go figure. We're different than our co-workers. We're different than our neighbors. We submit to our authorities and their laws. By the way, think about the speed limit. If you go 55 in a 55, you will be an alien and a stranger. Unless you're on Covered Bridge Road over here where nobody speeds up to 55 when it turns to 55. What's going on with that? Okay. Our authorities have said to us how fast we can drive. And we don't want to go that slowly. I love speed in a car. I love seeing how fast I can go around a turn. I love it. I took physics in college. I love applying, how you can approach a turn, and hit the gas at the right time so you grip the road and all that kind of thing. I love that. But you will be an alien and a stranger in the world if you obey the laws of this government. And so we as Christians, we don't cheat on our taxes. Okay? We don't cut corners. We do what we're supposed to do. If you're in school, you're the model student. You're the one who, in the teacher's lounge, your teacher says, hey, anyone have Billy in class? You're that one, Billy. And the other teachers speak up and say, yeah, boy, wouldn't it be great if we could have a classroom full of Billys? That's what God tells us to be. God tells us, so you see here, and we'll get into it in a little bit, that verse 15, for it is God's will that by doing good, and the first part of doing good is submitting to your authorities, by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. And that, yes, we're free men, next verse, but we don't use our freedom. We don't use the fact that Jesus is our true king, above all, as a cover-up for evil. And what's evil? In this context, evil is not submitting to our authorities. We don't say, oh, I don't have to obey my authorities. Jesus is my king. No, because Jesus is my king, I know that he's put my authority there. And so I obey my authority right there. Okay. So when we submit to our authorities, we're giving them a glimpse of what Jesus is like. So that's the second reason there. We want to give people a glimpse of what Jesus is like. Jesus makes his authority's job wonderful. He just submits. Even as a kid, Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and with men. Next thing. Why do we submit to our authorities? You submit to your authorities because you don't know the future. Now, I think I know the future, and you think you know the future, but you don't. We look forward to, we see our actions and potential actions we could have, and we try to guess what the consequence will be of this action. And that a lot of times drives us from submitting to our authorities, but we don't know our future. In other words, number one, there are many times the consequences of obedience to your authorities that you foresee are different from what actually happens. Many times the consequences that you see that seem certain to happen, if I obey my authority here, this will be bad for me, therefore I'm not going to obey my authority. That's us foreseeing the future, but we don't foresee the future. Unless you're Daniel and Joseph and you're given special revelation from God and you have these interpretations of dreams. Okay? But we don't see the future. We don't know the future. When I was in, some of you have heard this before, when I was in 5th grade, we moved from Rochester, New York to Columbus, Ohio. And I played on a traveling soccer team, and it was great. We traveled, all around Washington and Canada and various places. And I was a good soccer player, and I enjoyed playing. I played right wing. And then my coaches got wind that we were moving. And we like to think, maybe it was for something else, but we like to think that the reason I all of a sudden quit getting playing time, including a game where, I played all the time. I never got taken out of a game. That all of a sudden I had a game where I didn't play at all. And lots of time during games where I was playing half the game. That they were developing other players because I was going to be gone in a couple of months. And it was a team that you just stayed on through, as you grew up until you got to high school. And so I quit the team. And I joined up late. I got in just in time for the public soccer league, Pittsford Soccer League there. And so signing up late with a day before the deadline was over, or maybe a couple of days and some begging after the deadline was over, I got placed on the team where guys hadn't played soccer before. And so I went from being selected out of this league to play on an elite team for 2 years to playing on the worst team in this league, the team where no one had played before. And literally, I got moved from right wing, which is kind of on the side of the field, to center halfback because no one could get me the ball on the right wing. It just got stolen from them. Even at center halfback, guys couldn't get me the ball. And we played, but the advantage we had a coach who was All-American at Syracuse University. He had just graduated. His name was Doug Sutherland. And he had played defense at Syracuse University. And he took this team full of guys that were really awful. And he taught our defense something. It was called a diagonal defense, and it was really counterintuitive. And if you're really interested, I'll explain it to you later. It was really counterintuitive, and we lost every game of the season. But our guys trusted him. He was a good-looking guy, Doug Sutherland, our coach was, just out of college, so he looked like Mr. Atlas, right? And blonde hair. Oh, man, he was awesome. And we knew he was All-American. And our fullbacks, our defense trusted him. And they learned this diagonal defense. And we lost every game of the year. But every team got in the playoffs. We foresaw the future as, well, we're going to lose this next game and we'll be out of the playoffs, and that'll be, 0-11 for the season or whatever it was. But these guys in the defense had trusted their authority, our coach. And guess what? The defense kicked in. And nobody could get around our defense. They couldn't dribble, they couldn't pass, but they could get in the way. And they got in the way, and teams couldn't score on us, and we won the league. We won every playoff game, and we won the championship. No one could score on us. The semifinal we won 3-2. The final we won 2-0. Okay. If we could foresee our future, that would not have been it. If anybody in the whole league, including me and my parents, could have foreseen the future, that would not be what we foresaw. But what an example. Just obey your authority. Do what the coach says. And just maybe it'll work out. It'll work out for you. In other words, God has planned the future. You think you know the future and you don't. But God has planned the future and He will bring it about. Okay? With God, it's not that He foresees the future and He can tell us in advance what's going to happen. He's planned the future. He's going to make it happen. Therefore, He can tell us what's going to happen in the future. Because He's planned it already. He's going to make it happen. It's like a parent with a birthday party, right? You know what you're going to do first, what you're going to do second, what kind of cake is coming out, and when the parents are coming to pick up the kids. You've planned it, and you are going to bring it about. And God has planned your life, and He's going to bring it about. And 3, God's plan for you is for your good. God's plan for you is for your good. Verse 15, it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. Romans 8:28, for we know that all things work together for the good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. Joseph gets sold by his brothers into slavery in Egypt. The average life for a slave in Egypt was like 8 years or something like that. They died from exhaustion and bad treatment. And Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery into Egypt. And then